The issue of ISIS or the Islamic State in Southeast Asia has taken a dramatic turn in the last 6 months. With ISIS in the Middle East suffering a massive military defeat, we expect thousands of these fighters to come back to Southeast Asia. My guest today, Professor Joseph Liow, is an expert on ISIS in Southeast Asia, and he's the Dean of RSIS in Singapore. Thanks very much for coming to this web interview, Joe. So, can you tell us something about what's happening with ISIS? We have an understanding in this part of the region that ISIS is slowly being destroyed in the Middle East. So what is the latest on ISIS?
Well, I think as far as the ISIS Central is concerned, it is under intense military pressure, both from the US as well as Russia/Syrian forces, and it's on the back foot. And because of that, I think there is this concern, and it's a real concern, that you might have returnee fighters or even escapees, if you want to call it, from that conflict zone coming back to Southeast Asia. It's not going to be easy for them to come back. I think one thing we have to bear in mind is that unlike Afghanistan, for example, because people draw the analogy with Afghanistan, in Afghanistan the Southeast Asian fighters had a more elaborate support network, involving Pakistan, local groups, Saudi Arabian funding and things like that. But that is not so clear, not so evident as far as ISIS fighters are concerned. And over and above that, there's another important distinction, and that is that a lot of Southeast Asians going there, Indonesians, Malaysians, they had planned to hijrah there, right? They had planned to relocate there with their family, and they bring family in tow. Very different from Afghanistan. So, in other words, many of them coming back entails bringing the family back as well, which would be a more delicate, a more complicated exercise compared to just coming back on their own. So the logistics of it will be challenging, but that is not to say that it won't happen or that they won't try, because I think obviously if it's untenable there, it makes sense for them to try to come back. So that is one of the main challenges for Southeast Asian governments. A second one, if I may, are militants recruited who might have wanted to go, but for whatever reasons couldn't make it there, and they heed the call to actually wage their struggle, their jihad in Southeast Asia. So that is another facet of the problem, I think, that the Southeast Asian governments face.
Well, related to that issue is that has the recruitment pattern changed? As you mentioned, previously they were asking recruits to try to get to Sham directly.
Yeah.
Now that they're under attack, they're probably telling the recruits to start their own campaign in their own home countries.
Yes.
So have we seen a change in terms of recruitment patterns and the use of the social media?
Yeah. Well, I think to some degree we have, in the sense that, for example, I believe it was Bahrum Shah, who either Bahrum Shah or Bahrum Naim, or likely both of them, had sent message back to Southeast Asian recruits to wage the struggle here in the region, if they cannot make it over there. So there is a slight sort of reorientation of attention as well, right? I think as far as recruitment patterns are concerned, social media continues to be very important, but the degree of importance, I think, varies. I mean, if you compare Malaysia with Indonesia, I think in the case of Indonesia, the kind of face-to-face kind of recruitment patterns, the JI model, is still very prevalent even today, although there is obviously an upsurge in social media consumption of these sorts of radical and pro-ISIS ideas. But there are very explicit ISIS sympathetic groups operating in Indonesia, and they've managed to recruit through their networks, including tapping into the OJI networks as well. In Malaysia, there has been, in Malaysia, my sense is social media has played a bigger role in recruiting, and then it sort of bleeds into the lone wolf phenomenon. But that is not to say that there are no cells. So, for example, the lecturer Dr. Mahmood is known to have started a cell in a pro-ISIS cell in Malaysia. So there are these sort of cells operating involving actual individuals rather than the nebulous social media as well. But by and large, I think it's more prevalent in terms of recruitment strategies in Malaysia as compared to Indonesia.
Sure, I mean, we've seen research coming out in Indonesia that clearly maps in terms of recruitment, family links is paramount. Do we see a similar pattern emerging in Malaysia?
I'm not sure that it's as clear a pattern, but having said that, again, the interesting thing about the ISIS phenomenon as opposed to the JI phenomenon in the 90s, if you will, is that it's very explicit about family connections and the movement of families across over to the conflict zone. They really believe in the narrative, the ISIS narrative.
Sure, and the narrative is building a whole state.
Yes,
therefore
exactly.
You need to bring over a family.
Yeah. So I think that that subtext to that narrative is always there, and it will pose a challenge, I think, in that sense.
What about ISIS in Singapore?
ISIS in Singapore, we've seen cases of people networked, especially senior alim type characters or deemed to be alim, and then with their followers, younger followers. I don't think that there is any sort of a substantive sort of family kind of or in any major way. I think there might be a couple in terms of sympathizers, but the challenge in Singapore, or the threat in Singapore, has been, I mean, it's there, it's been contained, but it's still there, and the Singapore government is always very concerned that something, the mantra in Singapore is not if a terrorist attack happens, but when a terrorist attack happens. And in Singapore's case, the government is always very mindful of the impact on the social, the multicultural, multi-religious fabric. So it's at a low level, but it's there, and the government is very concerned.
What about ISIS influence in the southern Philippines? As you know, it's a Muslim majority area, and also southern Thailand.
Yeah, I think in southern Thailand, we haven't seen any sort of major influence. We've seen mention, talk about it. We've seen on Malay language, it's actually Indonesian, Bahasa Indonesia websites referring to the southern Thailand conflict, and then bringing in the black flag, right? But we haven't seen anything substantive. Southern Philippines, I think, is the biggest problem for our region, because especially Sulu, Basilan areas, these are really essentially ungoverned, I wouldn't say ungovernable, but certainly ungoverned areas in any substantive sense of the word. And it's most similar to the kind of areas that groups like ISIS would like to tap into, and hence all this concern about a possible wilayah being extension of the caliphate in Southeast Asia, in Sulu, in Basilan. I think the Philippine government, the security forces, have struggled and continue to struggle to contain the problem. I mean, you look at not just how frequent the number of incidents of clashes between the military and police with the militants, but also the casualty toll, including on the military side. It's funny, you think about it, the Americans, very soon after 9/11 and Ops Enduring Freedom, they launched Ops Enduring Freedom Philippines, right, in about 2002. And the specific objective of that operation was to eliminate the Abu Sayyaf group, right? And they pumped in, I think, hundreds of millions across more than a decade, right? And the troops withdrew in 2015, end of 2015, they started withdrawing. And then you think about it, is Abu Sayyaf weakened today compared to 2002? Difficult to say. In fact, I would suggest that they're actually stronger.
Yes.
So that is the magnitude of the problem, that the Philippines is facing.
But if you speak to the local analysts in the Philippines, I think the general consensus is that Abu Sayyaf have two features. One, on the one hand, they project themselves as an Islamic militant group.
Yes.
But at the local level, they basically sing as a kidnap ransom type of gang.
Yes.
So that's the reason why, because of the huge amount of money involved in hostage taking, I doubt very much, no matter how much money you pour into that region, it will be resolved.
No, absolutely.
So coming back to this issue of returnees, how are Southeast Asian governments coping with this issue? Are they aware of the issues and are they doing something about it?
Oh, they are definitely aware. They're definitely aware, and I think the good thing about the position of counter-terrorism efforts today is that unlike when they had to deal with the issue of Afghan returnees and the emerging jihadi threat from JI 1.5 decades ago, thereabouts, right? Southeast Asian governments are more prepared. They're more aware, they're more prepared for it. So that is, tactically speaking, that is an advantage, right? But the problem that they face is that you're looking at a region where in certain parts you're still talking about borders that are not just very porous, but very susceptible because of corruption, weak governance, so very susceptible to abuse by entities that want to move people and weapons around, including obviously groups like ISIS. Just recently, yesterday or today, the arrest of Malaysians supposedly trying to, ISIS sympathizers trying to use Sabah, Sandakan as a platform for returnees to transit on their way to Mindanao. These sorts of problems, and I think we probably will see more and more of these sorts of incidences where ISIS sympathizers in Malaysia, in Indonesia, including in the Philippines as well, try to use these very nebulous borders to facilitate these movements. So we're aware of the problem. The solution is a bit more challenging because it requires countries to cooperate with each other. So in a sense,
police action.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a good test for the ASEAN spirit. Whether we can walk the talk, so to speak.
Sure. Now, one of the crucial arguments among people who work in this area is that it's probably very difficult for places like Malaysia, Indonesia to deal with the ISIS issue, and part of the reason is because there was a large sympathetic population, and there was actually quite a large number of the clergy, the Islamic clergy, who support their ideology. Can I get your comments on this issue?
I wouldn't say that they support their ideology. I think the ISIS ideology, right? I don't think I don't think I would say that they support the ISIS ideology. The problem, the challenge is that they support or they are sympathetic to certain kinds of discourses that ISIS groups are also sympathetic to. So you're talking about an inadvertent convergence of two discourses towards the same end. Okay, so I give you an example. The notion of Shia Muslims, the tendency among many Southeast Asian Muslims and religious authorities to raise doubts as to whether the Shia is a legitimate school of Islam, ergo Shia Muslims, are they really Muslims or are they apostates, right, kafir? This is a debate that is not new in Southeast Asia, as you well know, whether Malaysia, Indonesia. But the problem is it blends very nicely, unfortunately, to a narrative, an ISIS narrative, which also seeks to not just label Shia as apostates, but basically to call for their call for Muslims to eliminate them, and the whole eschatological view of ISIS about the end time struggle involves this struggle not just with the Western forces, represented by Rome, that is to say the Western alliance, right, but also against the Shia. So what you have is two tracks that emerge parallel, because the same clerics, state-sponsored clerics who would rail against Shia Islam will also condemn ISIS. Let's be fair on that count, right? They also condemn ISIS.
But the issue of Shiite, they are common.
Exactly. So what they do, by keeping this issue alive, they make it all that much easier for ISIS type of ideology to find its way into society, whether in Indonesia or Malaysia. So that is the struggle. So if you have religious authorities who are in charge of sermons, right? One day they will write and disseminate a sermon that is anti-ISIS, and then the next day they will write a sermon and disseminate one which is anti-Shia, or anti-non-Muslims for that matter. So for I think you want to talk about creating confusion, that creates confusion for the general Muslim population, I think.
And for other people who work in this area, in recent years, they talk about the rise of Wahhabi ideology in this part of the world. How is this linked with the fight with ISIS?
I think the problem has been a long-standing one, right? Because of, since the early 80s, the influx of first educational institutions and then Islamic charities funded by Saudi Arabia, with you could say good intentions. Setting up schools, providing charities for society in general. But of course, what happened also was the influx of a particular brand or interpretation of the religion that is very exclusivist, very narrow, and on the back of this sponsorship, really starts to spread. You go to any rural Malay, Indonesian, or in Patani, kampong, you can tell which are the traditional schools and which are the traditional pondok schools and which are the Saudi-funded madrasas. Cement buildings, air conditioning. The physical structure itself, sticks out, right? And so for a lot of parents, in a sense, it's an obvious choice, right? And you get free education in a modern facilities. But because of that draw, because of that pull, then you start to see that sort of that sort of interpretation of the religion start to get entrenched, right? And it takes all sorts of directions, right? Including the debates about how Muslim majority societies should deal with non-Muslim minorities. It takes the form of debates over Sharia, hudud, and the like. But it also takes the form of even more virulent type of ideologies, like the kind that ISIS is propounding, right? Unfortunately, I think what has happened is the stage has been set, for various types of exclusivism, of which the kind of pro-ISIS or ISIS sympathetic type is one offshoot.
Now, asking you to look into the future, what would be the sort of policy recommendations you will give to Southeast Asian governments on dealing with these returnees and the ISIS threat in the future?
I think a number of things. I think number one is you will obviously need the sort of elements of what we call hard security, right? And I think on that count, regional states have improved since the early days of the HAI threat. I mean, in the Malaysian security services have always been very professional, very competent. In Indonesia, if you remember the early days, it was a bit iffy, but thanks to assistance from Australia, Malaysia, Singapore, even the US, they've Densas 88 has upped its game. So that element is important, but obviously that cannot be the only one. There's a lot of talk about religious rehabilitation. I think that helps, but we need to be mindful that not every ISIS sympathizer is a sympathizer because of religious reasons or doctrinal or reasons, right? I think a lot of Malaysian and Indonesian ISIS sympathizers are also in it for many other reasons, which perhaps you not only need an ulama to speak to them, but a social worker to speak to them. Yeah. I mean, I've always find it striking. You look at the gazillion YouTube videos of Southeast Asian fighters in Syria, in Iraq, and sometimes you get the impression that these young men enjoy that. It's a sense of adventure for them. A chance for them to live out their Rambo fantasies. So obviously, it's not just religious doctrine at work, but something else as well.
I was just going to remind you that in fact a lot of research have done that these people have a very shallow understanding of Islam.
Exactly.
And in fact, a lot of them is what for lack of a better word, we call them losers in society.
No, exactly. And the third thing I would add is I think it also requires political will on the part of leaders of the various countries involved. I mean, if you don't agree with my logic, then that's a different thing. But if you agree with the argument that one of the problems why ISIS has managed to sort of embed itself and draw on society in Southeast Asia is because certain conditions have been created, then we have to ask, number one, how were those conditions created? Why were they created? And how to pull back from that brink, right? The fact of the matter is a lot of it has been quite heavily politicized, and we know this. Many people, you have written on it. I have mentioned it as well. In the case of Malaysia, in the case of Indonesia as well. And here, political leaders have to be aware that, yes, as a politician, and many politicians do this, they play to the audience, right? They may not believe it, but it makes them popular by saying it. But on the other hand, while the politician may not believe it, the people may believe it. The people may believe every word you say, and they may be reacting to it not for the kind of instrumental reasons that you are that is behind your expression of these ideas, but because they really subscribe to it, and if that's the case, then it tends to lead to action, and then what you've basically done is you've opened a Pandora's box, and it's a very risky thing. I mean, it's not just religion. Nationalism is another thing, right? We talk about the Chinese nationalism, identity politics, exactly. But certainly in the case of ISIS popularity in the region, when we really ask ourselves what at heart accounts for the popularity of ISIS in the region, we cannot get away from these issues.
Yes, so it's always an issue of more than religion.
Yeah, very much so.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. I really
my pleasure.
appreciate talking to you.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.